The rain had stopped an hour ago, but the streets of Clayborne still glistened under the afternoon sun. Johnny Cash sat in the passenger seat of his tour manager's car, watching the small Tennessee town drift past the window. Brick buildings with faded advertisements painted on their sides, a barber shop with a red and white pole that probably hadn't turned in 20 years, a diner with 2 pickup trucks parked out front. "We've got 3 hours before sound check," his manager said, eyes on the road. "You want to grab lunch somewhere?" Johnny shook his head. "Just drop me off. I'll walk around. Meet you at the venue." The manager glanced at him. "You sure? This place isn't exactly Nashville. That's why I want to walk." The car pulled over near the town square, a modest patch of grass with a weathered gazebo and a bronze statue of some Civil War general whose name had worn off the plaque. Johnny stepped out, adjusted his black hat, and watched the car disappear around the corner. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the quiet. Clayborne was the kind of town you drove through on your way to somewhere else. Population maybe 3,000. One stoplight. A grain elevator on the edge of town. The kind of place that appeared on maps but felt like it had been forgotten by time. Johnny liked places like this. They reminded him of where he came from. Of Dyess, Arkansas. Of cotton fields and small hopes and people who worked hard and asked for nothing. He started walking, no particular destination in mind. Past the hardware store with its window display of garden tools that looked like they'd been there since Eisenhower. Past the library, a small Carnegie building with columns and stone steps. Past a real estate office that looked permanently closed. Then he saw it, a small brick building with a wooden sign hanging above the door. Clayborne Post Office, established 1889. The windows were dark. A handwritten note taped to the door. Closed for renovation. Mail service temporarily at Town Hall. Something about the building pulled at him. Maybe it was the age. Maybe it was the way it sat there, solid and patient, like it had been waiting for something. Johnny walked up to the door and peered through the glass. Inside, he could see dust floating in shafts of light. Old wooden sorting boxes on the walls. A counter with brass fixtures. He tried the door. Locked. But as he turned to leave, he noticed the side alley. A narrow passage between the post office and the adjacent building. Johnny hesitated, then walked down it. At the back of the building was a service door, paint peeling, hinges rusted. He tried the handle. It opened. The interior smelled of old paper and time. Dust motes swirled in the dim light, filtering through grimy windows. The floor was scuffed wood, worn smooth by a century of footsteps. Along one wall stood the sorting boxes, dozens of small wooden cubbies, each with a brass number plate. Some still had envelopes tucked inside, yellowed with age. Johnny walked slowly through the space, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. There was something sacred about abandoned places like this. Like walking through a church after everyone had gone home. The air held memory. In the back corner, near what had once been the postmaster's desk, Johnny saw a stack of wooden crates. Most were empty, but one, set apart from the others, had a lid. He lifted it carefully. Inside were bundles of letters, tied with twine, stacked in neat rows. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. On the inside of the lid, written in faded pencil, were the words, "Undelivered mail. Do not discard." Johnny's heart beat a little faster. He reached in and lifted out one of the bundles. The envelopes were old, some from the 1940s, judging by the stamps. Others from the 50s, 60s, 70s. All of them addressed to people in Clayborne or the surrounding county. All of them never delivered. He untied the twine and spread a few letters on the desk. Saw names and addresses. Saw postmarks from distant cities. Saw return addresses that no longer existed. Then he saw his own name. The envelope was cream-colored, aged to a light brown. The handwriting was careful, feminine. Addressed to Johnny Cash, care of Grand Ole Opry, Nashville, Tennessee. Postmarked June 15, 1963. Johnny's hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. The envelope had never been opened. It had been sitting here, in this box, in this abandoned post office, for 17 years. He carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, the kind from a school notebook. The handwriting was the same, neat, deliberate, the writing of someone who wanted every word to matter. Dear Mr. Cash, my name is Caroline Porter. I'm 16 years old and I live in Clayborne, Tennessee. I'm writing to you because I don't know who else to write to. My brother David died 3 weeks ago. He was 19. He was in Vietnam. They sent him home in a box, and we buried him in the cemetery on the hill where you can see the whole valley. David loved your music more than anything. He had all your records. Before he left, he played I Walk the Line so many times the record got scratched, and my mother had to buy him a new one. He said your music made him feel like it was okay to be sad sometimes, like it was okay to not have all the answers. When he was over there, he wrote me letters. In every single one, he asked me to send him news about you. Did you put out a new record? Were you on the Grand Ole Opry? He said that thinking about your music helped him get through the hard days. I'm writing to tell you that David's last letter came 2 days after we got the telegram. In it, he said he was scared. He said he didn't know if he was going to make it home. But he said that if he didn't, he wanted me to tell you something. He wanted you to know that your music saved him. Not from dying, I guess nothing could do that, but from feeling alone, from feeling like the darkness was all there was. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't even know if I'll send it, but I needed to write it down. I needed David's words to go somewhere. Thank you for the music. Thank you for being there for him when none of us could be. Sincerely, Caroline Porter. Johnny read the letter twice, then a third time. Each word felt like a weight settling on his chest. He thought about 1963, thought about where he'd been, what he'd been doing, probably on the road, probably playing show after show, town after town, thinking about his own problems, his own demons. He'd never received this letter, never knew David existed, never knew Caroline had sat down at a table somewhere in this small town and poured her grief onto paper and sent it into the world, hoping it would reach him. But it hadn't. It had ended up here, in a box marked Undelivered Mail, Do Not Discard. Johnny set the letter down carefully and reached for another bundle. Found 2 more addressed to him, one from 1967, one from 1971. He opened them both. The first was from a man named Robert Hayes, a truck driver who'd written to thank Johnny for the Folsom Prison album. Said he'd been in prison himself, said the music had helped him believe he could be something more than his mistakes. The second was from a woman named Margaret Dunn, a widow who'd written to say that Help Me Make It Through the Night had been her husband's favorite song, that she played it every evening after he died, and it helped her feel less alone. Johnny sat down heavily in the old postmaster's chair. The wood creaked under his weight. He stared at the letters spread before him, these messages that had traveled halfway across the country, that had contained hope and gratitude and pain and connection, and had all ended up here, lost, forgotten, never delivered. Why? Johnny found the answer an hour later, in the Clayborne Town Hall. The building was just across the square, a white column structure that housed the mayor's office, the town clerk, and the temporary post office. Johnny walked in, the letters in his hand, and asked to speak to whoever was in charge of mail service. They sent him to a small office on the 2nd floor, where an older woman sat behind a desk covered in papers and rubber stamps. Her nameplate read Doris Kincaid, postmaster. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking up over reading glasses. Johnny set the letters on her desk. "I found these, in the old post office building. There's a whole box of them back there. Undelivered mail, some of it going back 40 years. Doris picked up one of the envelopes, studied it, and sighed. "Oh, those. Why weren't they delivered?" She set the letter down and leaned back in her chair. "That's a long story, but I suppose you have time." "I do." Doris stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulled out a folder, and brought it back to the desk. The old postmaster was a man named Harold Gaines. Took over the job in 1942. Ran that office for 37 years. By all accounts, he was good at his work, reliable, conscientious. She opened the folder, revealing old photographs and documents. But starting in the early 60s, Harold developed a problem. He became convinced that certain letters shouldn't be delivered, not because they were dangerous or illegal, but because he thought they were too important, too precious. He thought that if he delivered them, they might get lost or thrown away. So he started keeping them, storing them, protecting them as he saw it. Johnny stared at her. He kept letters from being delivered because he thought they mattered too much. That's right. It started small, just a few letters here and there. Letters that he thought were particularly heartfelt or significant. But over the years, it got worse. By the time he retired in 1979, there were thousands of letters in that box. Love letters, condolence letters, letters to soldiers, letters to musicians and actors and politicians, letters from children to their parents. All of them undelivered because Harold couldn't bear to let them go. She closed the folder. When the new postmaster took over and found the box, there was talk of delivering them. But most of the addresses were old. People had moved or died. The return addresses didn't exist anymore. There was no good way to get them where they were supposed to go. So they stayed in that box. With the note, "Do not discard." Because even though they'd never be delivered, someone thought they deserved to be kept. Johnny picked up Caroline's letter. This one was for me. I never knew it existed. Doris looked at the envelope, then at Johnny. For the first time, recognition flickered in her eyes. "Mr. Cash?" He nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There are probably others." Harold had a particular fondness for letters to famous people. He thought they were, I don't know, historical, maybe. Like he was preserving something important. "Can I see the rest of them?" Johnny asked. "The ones addressed to me?" "I suppose so, though I'm not sure there's much I can do officially. The post office doesn't really have a procedure for this." "I understand, but I'd like to see them anyway, if that's all right." Doris nodded slowly. "I'll give you the key to the old building. You can go back. Take your time. Just lock up when you're done." Johnny spent the next 2 hours in the old post office, going through the box of undelivered mail. He found 11 letters addressed to him, 11 people who'd taken the time to write, to share their stories, to reach across the distance and try to touch something real. A young man in Kentucky who wanted to be a musician and was asking for advice. An elderly woman in Ohio who'd lost her son and found comfort in Sunday morning coming down. A prison inmate in Texas who'd heard Johnny's music on the radio and felt seen for the first time in years. A mother in Georgia whose daughter had died of cancer and who'd played "If I Were a Carpenter" at the funeral. Each letter was a small life, a moment of vulnerability and courage. Someone reaching out into the void, hoping to be heard. And none of them had ever reached him. Johnny sat in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by these ghosts of connection. He thought about all the letters he had received over the years. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. He'd never responded to most of them. There hadn't been time. There had always been another show, another studio session, another crisis. But these letters, the ones that had never arrived, they felt different. They felt like a responsibility he hadn't known he carried. One letter in particular stayed with him. It was from Caroline Porter, the girl who'd written about her brother David. Johnny looked at the date again. June 15th, 1963. 17 years ago. Caroline would be 33 now, if she still lived in Clayborne. Johnny stood up, carefully folded the letter, and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he locked the post office door behind him and walked back to town hall. Doris helped him search the town records, found a Caroline Morrison, formerly Porter, living on rural Route 4 just outside town. Johnny borrowed a phone and called the number. A woman answered. "Hello? Is this Caroline Morrison?" "Yes. Who's calling?" Johnny hesitated. "My name is Johnny Cash. I know this is going to sound strange, but I just found a letter you wrote to me in 1963 about your brother David." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, quietly, where did you find it?" "It's a long story, but I'd like to talk to you about it, if you're willing." Another silence. Then, "I'll be home all evening. Do you know how to get here?" "I'll find it." The house was small and white, set back from the road behind a line of oak trees. A tire swing hung from one of the branches. A dog barked as Johnny pulled up in the rental car his manager had grudgingly agreed to let him borrow. Caroline met him at the door. She was in her 30s, dark hair going gray at the temples, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. Her eyes were David's eyes. The same shape, the same color, the same depth. "Mr. Cash," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "Please, call me Johnny." She nodded and stepped aside. "Come in." The interior was warm and modest. Family photographs on the walls. A piano in the corner. The smell of something baking. Two children, a boy and a girl, maybe 8 and 10, peeked around the kitchen doorway before their mother shooed them away. Caroline led Johnny to the living room and they sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Johnny reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter. Set it on the coffee table between them. "I found this today," he said. "In the old post office. There's a whole box of letters that were never delivered. This was one of them." Caroline picked up the letter. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it and read her own words from 17 years ago. Tears slid down her face, though she didn't make a sound. "I thought you'd ignored it," she said finally. "All these years, I thought you'd gotten it and just didn't care enough to respond. I told myself that's how it is with famous people. They get too many letters. They can't answer them all." "I never got it," Johnny said quietly. "I would have answered, if I'd known." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "David would have loved that. He talked about you like you were someone he knew, like you were a friend even though you'd never met. Tell me about him." And she did. She told Johnny about David Porter, about how he'd been the kind of kid who helped neighbors with their yard work without being asked, how he'd wanted to be a teacher, how he'd volunteered for Vietnam because he thought it was the right thing to do, even though it scared him, how his letters home had been full of fear and hope and the kind of honesty that only comes when you don't know if you'll have another chance to speak. She told him about the funeral, about how the whole town had come, about how the preacher had said David was a hero, but all Caroline could think was that heroes were supposed to come home. She told him about the years after, about how she'd married Tom Morrison, a good man who worked at the grain elevator, about their 2 children, about how she still thought about David every day, about how she played Johnny's records sometimes and remembered her brother's face when he'd listened to them. "He's buried here in town," she said, "in the cemetery on the hill. If you'd like to see it." Johnny nodded. "I would." They drove together in Caroline's station wagon, the children in the back seat, quiet and curious. The cemetery was at the edge of town, on a rise that looked out over the valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. David's grave was simple. A flat stone with his name, his dates, and the words, "Beloved son and brother." Johnny stood there for a long time, hat in his hands. He thought about all the soldiers he'd sung for over the years, all the young men who'd gone to war and come back changed, or not at all. He thought about the responsibility of being heard, of being someone that people turned to when they needed hope. He'd never asked for that responsibility, but it was his anyway. Caroline stood beside him, her children holding her hands. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. "It would have meant the world to David." Johnny looked at her. "I'm sorry I didn't know. I'm sorry the letter never reached me. It reached you now. Maybe that's what matters." That night, after the concert, after the lights and the applause and the familiar rhythms of performance, Johnny sat alone in his hotel room with the 11 undelivered letters spread across the bed. He thought about Harold Gaines, the postmaster who'd kept these letters because he thought they were too precious to deliver. The man had been wrong, of course. Letters were meant to be received. Connection was meant to happen. But Johnny understood the impulse, the desire to protect something beautiful from being lost. He thought about Caroline, writing to him at 16 with a heart full of grief, about David, listening to "I Walk the Line" in a jungle on the other side of the world, about all the people who'd written to him over the years, who'd trusted him with their stories, who'd believed he might understand. He couldn't answer these letters. Most of the people who'd written them were probably gone, or moved, or had stopped waiting for a response decades ago. But he could do something. Johnny picked up his guitar and played a few chords, thought about the words Caroline had written. Your music saved him, not from dying, but from feeling alone. He played through the night, working out a melody, finding words, creating something that felt like an answer to letters that had never been delivered, a song about distance and connection, about the invisible threads that bind people together across time and space, about the quiet ways we touch each other's lives without knowing. He didn't have a title yet, but the words came steady and sure, like they'd been waiting all along. 3 months later, Johnny released a new album, On it was a song he'd written in a hotel room in Tennessee, a song about undelivered letters and forgotten people and the weight of being heard, a song about responsibility and grace and the miraculous fact that music can travel where words cannot. He never explained where the song came from, never told the story publicly, but he sent a copy to Caroline with a note that said simply, "For David, this one reached you." And years later, when Johnny was much older and his voice had grown rough with age and illness, he'd think about that day in Clayborne, about the abandoned post office and the box of undelivered mail, about the 11 letters that had never reached him and the thousands more that had. He'd think about Harold Gaines, the misguided postmaster who'd tried to preserve beauty by holding it back. And Johnny would understand, in a way he hadn't before, that the man had been both wrong and right. Wrong about keeping the letters, right about knowing they mattered. Because every letter mattered, every voice mattered, every person who'd ever reached out in hope or grief or joy, who'd put pen to paper and sent their words into the world, they all mattered. And the weight of that, the responsibility of being heard, of being trusted with people's stories, it was a burden Johnny carried gladly, because it meant his life had meant something beyond the songs, beyond the fame, beyond the man in black. It meant he'd been part of something larger than himself, part of the invisible web of human connection that holds the world together. And in the end, maybe that was all any of us could hope for: to be heard, to be remembered, to matter to someone. The letters had never been delivered, but they'd arrived anyway, in their own time, in their own way. And that, Johnny thought, was enough.